October 13th, 1944. Bahnstrasse, Aachen, Germany. Darkness, thick as oil in the cellar beneath the shattered townhouse. Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann presses his back against cold stone, Kar 98K rifle across his chest, and allows himself a grim smile. Above him, boots scrape across rubble. American voices, low and tense. His 5 men wait in absolute silence on the second floor, rifles trained on the single stairwell entrance. This is what they trained for. This is where the Wehrmacht owns the fight. Every building a fortress, every hallway a killing ground. In rooms this tight, this dark, the Americans with their long Garans will be slaughtered before they can even aim. Zimmermann has held positions like this in Russia, in France. He knows how this ends. The door explodes inward. Then a sound he has never heard in 3 years of war. Not the crack of a rifle, but a thunderous roar that seems to detonate inside his skull. Boom, chak, boom, 3 times in 4 seconds. The narrow corridor erupts. His 2 forward men don't fall. They disintegrate, torn apart by something that spreads like God's own fist. At 12 feet, there is no cover, no dodge, no chance. Zimmermann survives only because he was reloading behind the doorframe. As he stumbles backward through the rear exit, hands shaking, ears screaming, he sees the Americans advancing through the smoke. One of them carries something short and brutal, not a rifle at all. Everything they taught him is a lie. What kind of weapon doesn't need to aim? Zimmermann doesn't sleep that night. He can't. Every time he closes his eyes, he sees Corporal Dietrich's chest cavity, where his chest used to be, sees the way Schmidt's face simply ceased to exist in that hallway's confined thunder. He sits in the cellar command post beneath the rat house, hands wrapped around cold coffee, and tries to explain to Hauptmann Werner what he witnessed. "It wasn't like a rifle, sir. It was like a grenade that could be aimed, but not aimed. It didn't need to be aimed." Werner, a veteran of Stalingrad who wears his Knight's Cross, like armor against doubt, waves him off. "You panicked. In close quarters, Americans panic too. We hold the buildings, we hold the city." But Zimmermann sees the flicker of uncertainty in the captain's eyes, because 3 other survivors have reported the same impossible weapon, the same instant obliteration at ranges where German doctrine promised absolute dominance. What none of them understand yet, what Zimmermann will only grasp in the awful days ahead, is that the Americans haven't just brought a new weapon to Aachen. They've brought a new kind of war. The confidence that fills Aachen's defenders in those early October days isn't arrogance. It's the bone-deep certainty that comes from doctrine validated across 3 continents and 5 years of industrial slaughter. The Wehrmacht's defensive manual, written in the blood of the Eastern Front and refined in the hell of Italian mountain. Warfare is explicit. Urban terrain multiplies the defender's advantages geometrically. Every window becomes a rifle position. Every stairwell a fatal funnel. Every basement a bunker. The Germans hold Aachen with 5,000 men, most of them veterans who've survived campaigns that would break lesser armies. They've transformed the medieval city into a fortress, built not of stone, but of overlapping fields of fire, pre-positioned machine guns, and the cold mathematics of defensive warfare. The MG-42, Hitler's buzzsaw, can fire 1,200 rounds per minute and turn any street corner into a killing zone. The Kar 98K rifle, refined through generations of Prussian military engineering, can kill a man at 800 meters with iron sights. These aren't just weapons. They're the physical manifestation of German military philosophy: precision, discipline, and the ruthless application of superior training. Oberst Wilk, commanding from his headquarters in the Palast Hotel, has every reason for confidence. The Americans are attacking with the 1st Infantry Division, yes, the big red one, veterans of North Africa and Normandy. But urban combat isn't open-field warfare. In the choke points and cellars of Charlemagne's ancient capital, every advantage shifts to the defender who knows his ground. Wilk's orders are clear and based on ironclad doctrine. Hold every building to the last. Make them pay for every room. The Americans excel at firepower and maneuver in open country. But here, in these medieval streets where visibility is measured in meters and firing lines collapse into arm's reach, the Wehrmacht's superior tactical training will prevail. It has to. Because if it doesn't, if German defensive doctrine fails in the First Reich city to face Allied assault, then everything they've believed about their military superiority is a lie written in peacetime manuals by men who never imagined warfare could become this intimate, this savage, this fundamentally unlike the war they'd prepared for. October 15th. House 47 on Adalbert-Steinweg isn't marked on American tactical maps as anything special. Just another 3-story townhouse in the Lausberg district, walls 2 feet thick, basement reinforced, second-floor windows commanding the intersection. But Zimmermann and his squad have transformed it into exactly what Doctrine promises: a prepared killing position. They've knocked mouse holes through interior walls for alternate exits. They've positioned furniture to create firing lanes. The MG-42 team on the 3rd floor has interlocking coverage with the position across the street. When the Americans come, and they will come, because the 26th Infantry Regiment is grinding forward, building by building, leaving nothing unsecured behind them, they'll walk into a textbook ambush. Zimmermann checks his rifle for the 100th time. The Kar 98K is a beautiful weapon, accurate to ranges that would astonish American conscripts raised on semi-automatic Garands. But beauty doesn't matter here. What matters is that when Americans come through that door, when they bunch up in the fatal funnel of the stairwell, 6 German rifles will cut them down before they can react. It's happened in a dozen buildings already. The Americans are brave but predictable. They stack at the door, they rush in together, and German fire discipline, 3 years of training distilled into muscle memory, turns their courage into corpses. Except, that's not what happens. Zimmermann hears them coming, boots on cobblestones, the distinctive sound of American equipment jangling. He signals his men into position, rifles trained, breathing controlled. The door is barricaded. They'll have to break it down, giving away their entry point, bunching up exactly where German fire will be most devastating. This is Doctrine. This is science. The door doesn't break down. It explodes. Not from a grenade. There's no fragmentation, no blast wave. The hinges simply disintegrate as if struck by lightning, and the door falls inward. And through the smoke comes something Zimmermann's 3 years of combat have never shown him. The American soldier isn't carrying an M1 Garand. He's carrying something short and blunt and impossibly loud. And before Zimmermann can even process the wrongness of it, the weapon speaks. Boom. The sound isn't a crack or a bang, but a physical force that hammers the air itself. At 12 feet in a corridor, 18 inches wide, the blast pattern of 9.33 caliber lead balls, traveling at 1,200 feet per second, doesn't spread like rifle fire. It spreads like God's own hand sweeping the hallway clean. Zimmermann's 2 forward men, Dietrich and Schmidt, veterans of Kursk, survivors of Normandy, don't fall wounded. They're torn apart, literally dismembered by a weapon that doesn't distinguish between flesh and bone and uniform, that simply removes everything in its cone of devastation and leaves only red mist and the ringing aftermath of impossible thunder. Chak boom. The American works his weapon with a sound like bones breaking and fires again, and the 3rd man in Zimmermann's position ceases to exist as anything recognizable as human. 3 shots, 4 seconds, 3 dead, not wounded, not dying, simply gone. And Zimmermann, who was reloading behind a door frame, who survives only because of blind luck and the accident of position, realizes with the sick clarity of absolute terror that everything he was taught is obsolete. The rifles that won them battles in the wheat fields of Ukraine are too long for this butcher's work. The doctrine that promised defensive superiority has never encountered an enemy willing to bring weapons designed for hunting ducks and close-range police raids into military combat. The Americans haven't come to fight a battle, They've come to conduct an execution, and they've brought exactly the right tool for the job. To understand why Aachen's defenders believed so completely in their invincibility, you have to understand what the Wehrmacht had learned in 5 years of total war across 3 continents. Urban combat wasn't theoretical for these men. It was written in the rubble of Stalingrad, refined in the narrow streets of Italian hill towns, perfected in the brutal house-to-house fighting that had characterized the Eastern Front since 1941. German defensive doctrine, codified in field manuals and tactical bulletins distributed to every company commander, was built on mathematical certainty. In cities, every advantage shifts to the defender. The attacker must expose himself to advance. The defender chooses his position, prepares his fields of fire, and forces the enemy into fatal funnels, where courage becomes suicide. Aachen's medieval layout seemed designed by Providence to validate this doctrine. Streets barely wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast. Buildings with walls thick enough to stop anything short of direct artillery hits. Basements and attics creating vertical battlefields where a single MG-42 team could hold off a company. The city's 19 square kilometers contained over 50,000 buildings, each one a potential fortress. Each one requiring American infantry to expose themselves at the exact moment of entry when defensive fire would be most lethal. Oberst Wilk's defensive plan read like a textbook example of military science. Interlocking positions, prepared fallback routes, pre-registered artillery coordinates, and the absolute certainty that American infantry, armed with rifles effective at 500 yards, would be slaughtered at 15 feet in darkened rooms, where their technological advantages meant nothing. The Germans had the terrain. They had the training. They had 5 years of combat experience that taught them one immutable truth. In close quarters, defensive preparation defeats offensive courage every single time. What changes everything is a weapon that nobody in the Wehrmacht takes seriously until it's too late. The Ithaca Model 37 isn't a military innovation. It's a commercial hunting shotgun designed by John Browning and manufactured in Ithaca, New York, for American sportsmen who want to shoot ducks and deer. It holds 5 12-gauge shells in a tubular magazine beneath the barrel. It has no external hammer, making it sleek and snag-free in tight spaces. It weighs 7 pounds. It costs $35 to manufacture. And in the hands of American infantry advancing through Aachen's shattered buildings, it becomes something that German military doctrine has no answer for, no counter to, no conceptual framework to even understand. Because the shotgun doesn't play by the rules that govern rifle combat. A rifle fires a single projectile that requires aim, distance calculation, breathing control, all the marksmanship skills that German training emphasizes and excels at. A shotgun fires 9 .33 caliber lead balls per shell, spreading in a cone pattern that at 10 feet covers an area 3 riflemen would need to coordinate their fire to match. In darkness, in dust, in rooms thick with cordite smoke where visibility is measured in arm's reach, the shotgun doesn't need precision. It just needs proximity. And proximity is exactly what urban combat guarantees. American sergeants, many of them farm boys from Kansas and Iowa, who grew up hunting pheasant and quail, understand something that Prussian military academies never taught. At conversational distance, spread pattern defeats accuracy every time. The doctrine that emerges in Aachen's first days is brutally simple. Every assault squad has at least one shotgun-armed point man. He's the first through every door, the first up every stairwell. The man who turns room clearing from a careful, coordinated process into a 4-second execution. Blow the door hinges with a shotgun blast. The spread pattern hits all 3 hinges simultaneously. Rush through the smoke. Fire into the corners where German doctrine says defenders must position themselves. The sound alone, that thunderous boom in enclosed spaces amplified by stone walls and low ceilings, triggers something beyond tactical panic. It's the sound of industrial-age warfare reduced to its most primitive essence. The sound of being hunted in the dark by something that doesn't miss. The pattern emerges with the cold clarity of statistical inevitability over October 15th and 16th. German defenders start recognizing the signature of American assault tactics, the distinctive boom-chack-boom rhythm of pump-action shotguns clearing rooms. The way American infantry no longer hesitates at doorways, no longer carefully angles their rifle fire, no longer gives defenders the precious seconds needed to aim and fire first. They breach with explosives or shotgun blasts to the hinges. They flood through the opening behind a cone of buckshot, and they clear rooms in the time it takes a German soldier to work his bolt-action rifle. Zimmermann's unit, what's left of it, loses 40% strength in 2 days. Most die in the first 3 seconds of contact, the moment when German doctrine says they should have the advantage, when prepared positions and superior training should guarantee victory. Instead, they die before they can even identify targets, torn apart by weapons that don't require the Americans to see them clearly, just to know approximately where they're standing. The psychological effect is more devastating than the physical casualties. German soldiers who've survived Stalingrad's frozen hell, who've endured Allied bombing campaigns and Russian artillery barrages, start breaking at the sound of approaching combat. Not from cowardice, from the rational calculation that their training, their weapons, their entire tactical philosophy offers no defense against enemies who've weaponized intimacy itself. Officers try desperately to adapt. Barricade doors with furniture. The Americans bring satchel charges that turn furniture into shrapnel. Retreat deeper into buildings to create multiple defensive positions. The Americans clear each room with the same mechanical efficiency. Boom, chack boom. Moving like an assembly line of death through spaces where German rifles become expensive clubs. Some defenders try using grenades, but grenades in confined spaces kill indiscriminately, and the Americans learn to let the blast pass before rushing through the smoke with shotguns ready. There is no counter-doctrine for this level of savage pragmatism, no tactical adjustment that changes the fundamental calculus. When combat happens at ranges where you can smell your enemy's fear, the weapon optimized for that range wins. And the Americans have brought 12-gauge answers to a 500-meter question. And German defensive doctrine is dying one room at a time, one thunderous shotgun blast at a time, in the medieval cellars of a city that was supposed to prove Wehrmacht superiority forever. October 18th becomes the day when German defensive doctrine doesn't just fail. It commits suicide in front of witnesses who will carry the memory like shrapnel for the rest of their lives. Sturmbannführer Ernst Köhler, a veteran of the Afrika Korps who wears his combat decorations like a shield against doubt, makes a decision born of desperation disguised as tactical genius. His men are being slaughtered in the buildings, hunted room by Americans with those damned shotguns that turn prepared positions into abattoirs. So Köhler orders a fundamental shift. They'll abandon building defense and meet the Americans in the streets, in the rubble, in open positions where German rifles can use their superior range, and where those close-quarters butcher weapons become irrelevant. It's classical military thinking. Deny the enemy his advantage, impose your own strengths, control the engagement distance. On paper, in a field manual, in a tactical exercise at a training ground in Bavaria, it's sound doctrine. In the Farwick Park district on a gray October morning with American artillery coordinates, already plotted, and American infantry trained to clear rubble with the same savage efficiency they clear rooms, it's a death sentence issued in triplicate. Köhler positions his men, what's left of 2 companies, maybe 80 soldiers who've survived the week's meat grinder, in crater positions and behind rubble piles, covering the approaches to the park. They have good fields of fire. They have the high ground where the park's terraces survived the bombing. They have rifles that can kill at 300 meters. What they don't have is any understanding that the Americans aren't coming to fight a rifle duel. They're coming to execute a combined arms assault that treats German defensive positions not as obstacles to be overcome, but as grid coordinates to be erased. The artillery comes first, because it always comes first when Americans have the shells to spare, and the forward observers to direct them. 155mm howitzers firing from positions west of the city, each shell carrying 43 pounds of high explosive, each impact creating a kill radius measured in meters. The rubble that Köhler thought would provide cover becomes a weapon turned against his men. Stone fragments accelerated to the speed of rifle bullets. Wooden beams transformed into massive splinters. The very terrain weaponized by the physics of high explosives in confined urban spaces. The barrage lasts 12 minutes. 12 minutes of earth-shaking impacts that collapse what's left of the park's retaining walls, that turn defensive positions into open graves, that leave survivors deafened and bleeding from concussive damage alone. And then, the American infantry advances, not in parade ground lines, but in loose squads, using the rubble for cover, moving with the confidence of men who know the artillery has already done the killing work, and they're just here to mop up. Except they're not just mopping up, because Köhler's men, the ones who survived the artillery, still have fight in them, still have rifles and the training to use them. They rise from their positions, ears ringing, vision blurred, and they fire. They hit Americans. They score kills at ranges where rifles should dominate. For perhaps 30 seconds, classical military doctrine works exactly as promised. German marksmanship and superior training, allowing prepared defenders to exact a toll on exposed attackers. Then, the Americans adapt, because adaptation is what keeps you alive in urban warfare. And what happens next is something Köhler watches through a blown-out window, 300 meters away. Something he will see in nightmares for the rest of his short life. An American sergeant, carrying one of those short, brutal shotguns, simply walks up to a crater where 3 of Köhler's men are firing from cover. Not running, not using suppressing fire. Just walking with the casual confidence of a man who knows his weapon's effective range and knows he's inside it. The Germans see him coming. They try to work their bolts, to chamber fresh rounds, to bring their rifles to bear on a target that's now 15 feet away and closing. The sergeant reaches the crater's lip, looks down into it like a farmer inspecting a hole in his field, and fires 3 times. Boom, check, boom, check, boom. The sound echoes across the Farwick Park district, that distinctive thunder that every German soldier in Aachen has learned to fear. No screams follow, just silence, because at 8 feet the buckshot pattern is still tight. Fist-sized entry wounds, basketball-sized exits, and the simple mechanical reality that the human body cannot sustain that kind of tissue damage and remain capable of screaming. Köhler watches 6 more positions fall the same way over the next hour. American rifle squads suppress the defenders with M1 fire, 8 rounds without reloading, that semi-automatic advantage keeping. German heads down. Then the shotgun teams move in, casual as executioners, and clear the rubble piles with the same efficient brutality they use on rooms. Distance, that sacred principle of German defensive doctrine, means nothing when Americans are willing to close it, when they've weaponized proximity itself and turned classical tactical thinking into a suicide pact. By noon, Köhler has lost 53 men, not to superior tactics or better training, but to a fundamental philosophical difference in warfare. The Germans are fighting to win engagements. The Americans are fighting to end fights as fast and brutally as possible. And they've brought exactly the right tools for the job. Zimmermann, now a squad leader because everyone above him is dead or evacuated with shattered nerves, receives his new orders on the evening of October 18th. Hold the cellars beneath the rat house, the city hall, until relieved. Everyone knows relief isn't coming. Everyone knows this is where the Wehrmacht's defensive doctrine comes to die, in medieval stone cellars that should be impregnable fortresses, but are actually just elaborate tombs. His 5 men, none from his original squad, all strangers bound together only by the fact that they've survived this long, arrange themselves in the cellar approach, rifles trained on the stone stairway that descends from street level. This is textbook defensive positioning, single point of entry, stone walls that will contain American grenades, and turn them against their throwers. Limited fields of fire that should favor defenders who know exactly where enemies must appear. Everything Doctrine promises should work here. Everything tactical training says should give them the advantage. Zimmerman knows better now, has learned the lesson written in blood across a dozen buildings. But he positions his men anyway because orders are orders, and doctrine is doctrine. And what else can you do except die in the approved manner? The Americans don't rush in. They take their time, because time is the one resource Americans have in infinite supply. Time and ammunition and artillery, and shotgun shells manufactured in factories that German bombers can't reach. First comes a smoke grenade, bouncing down the stone steps, hissing as it fills the cellar with gray fog that turns rifle fire into guesswork. Then, through the smoke, that sound, boom, chack boom, methodical, mechanical. The rhythm of something that isn't fighting for survival, but simply processing targets in the approved sequence. 2 of Zimmerman's men break and run, because fear has a sound, and it sounds like pump-action shotguns in enclosed spaces. The buckshot catches them in the back at 8 feet, and Zimmerman, who is 22 years old and has aged a lifetime in 6 days, simply raises his hands. He surrenders, not from cowardice, but from the cold mathematical certainty that doctrine has failed, tradition has failed, and survival belongs to those who recognize when the war you trained for has been replaced by something your training never imagined. By October 20th, Colonel Gerhard Wilk sits in the Quellenhof Hotel's reinforced command bunker and confronts a truth that no amount of Knight's Crosses or campaign ribbons can deflect. The battle for Aachen is over, not because his men lack courage, but because courage has become irrelevant when doctrine itself is the enemy. The numbers tell a story that pride cannot rewrite. He began with 5,000 defenders, a mixture of Wehrmacht regulars, Volksgrenadiers, and scattered units consolidated from other theaters. Now he commands perhaps 300 combat-effective soldiers, and even that number is generous if you discount the men whose hands shake too badly to work a rifle bolt, whose eyes have acquired that 1,000-yard emptiness that marks psychological destruction as surely as wounds mark physical trauma. The Quellenhof itself, this grand hotel transformed into a fortress with the same meticulous German engineering that built the Atlantic Wall, represents the final redoubt of a defensive philosophy that the Americans have methodically dismantled room by room, building by building, with weapons that cost $35 and were designed to hunt waterfowl. Wilk has received the American ultimatum: surrender within 1 hour or face final assault. He knows exactly what final assault means now, has read the after-action reports from his surviving company commanders, has listened to men like Zimmerman describe in flat, affectless voices what happens when shotguns meet prepared defensive positions in enclosed spaces. The Americans don't need to storm the Quellenhof with dramatic frontal assaults. They'll just bring their shotguns and their satchel charges, and their absolute pragmatic willingness to turn warfare into industrial-scale butchery at conversational distance. And his 300 men will die defending a hotel in a city that stopped being defensible the moment someone realized that hunting weapons outperform military rifles, when the enemy is close enough to smell. Inside the Quellenhof, Wilk's men wait with the particular quality of dread that comes from knowing exactly how you're going to die. These aren't raw conscripts. Among them are veterans of Stalingrad, men who held the Volga's west bank against Soviet winter offensives that killed by the division. They survived the Eastern Front, survived Normandy, survived campaigns that would be taught in military academies for generations as examples of defensive excellence under impossible conditions. But Aachen has broken something fundamental in these men, severed the connection between training and survival that every soldier depends on to function in combat. They've learned that their Kar 98K rifles, masterpieces of engineering that can put rounds through a man's chest at 800 meters, are worse than useless at 8 feet against weapons that don't aim so much as point in the general direction of human presence. They've learned that prepared positions and fields of fire, and all the tactical terminology that filled their training manuals mean nothing when the Americans bring door-breaching charges and follow the blast with shotgun-armed point men who clear rooms faster than you can chamber a round. Most devastatingly, they've learned that German defensive doctrine, the accumulated wisdom of Prussian military tradition refined through 2 world wars, has met its evolutionary predator in American pragmatism, unbound by tradition or sporting concepts of warfare. One of the Stalingrad survivors, a Feldwebel named Kraus, who has 3 tank kill rings on his finger and a face like weathered granite, speaks for all of them when he tells his squad, "I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of dying to a duck gun in the hands of a Kansas farm boy who never even finished gymnasium." It's not the fear of death. Soldiers make peace with that, or they don't survive their first contact. It's the fear of death that renders meaningless everything you've trained for, suffered for, believed, gave your sacrifice purpose. The hour passes. Wilk makes his decision not from cowardice, but from the cold mathematics of command responsibility. He can order his 300 men to fight to the last, can demand they die upholding defensive doctrine that has already failed catastrophically, can sacrifice them on the altar of military tradition, and watch them be torn apart by weapons the Wehrmacht doesn't even classify as serious military hardware. Or he can acknowledge that the battle was lost, not on October 20th, but on October 13th, the moment the first American point man brought a shotgun into Aachen's medieval corridors and discovered that at room-clearing distance, spread pattern defeats precision every single time. At 12:05 p.m., Wilk orders his signals officer to transmit the surrender. The white flags appear in windows throughout the Quellenhof. German soldiers file out into October sunlight, hands raised, faces hollow, and they pass American infantry who hold their Ithaca, 37 shotguns with casual confidence, weapons that aren't even loaded because there's no need anymore. The shotgun has already won through reputation alone, through the psychological devastation of 19 days watching defensive doctrine commit suicide against pragmatic innovation. One American GI, watching the German prisoners shuffle past, remarks to his sergeant, "They look like they've seen ghosts." The sergeant, his shotgun slung over his shoulder with the ease of a man carrying a familiar tool, replies quietly, "They have. We brought the war down to where you can smell it." It's a profoundly accurate observation, because that's exactly what the shotgun has done. It's eliminated the distance that allows soldiers to maintain the psychological separation between combat and murder, between military action and intimate violence. At 500 yards, you shoot at uniforms and concepts. At 10 feet, you kill specific human beings whose faces you see in the muzzle flash, whose blood sprays back on you, whose deaths become personal, even when doctrine insists they should be tactical. As Zimmerman is processed through the POW collection point, an American lieutenant asks through a translator the question that seems to puzzle the victors. Why did you keep fighting when you knew you'd lose? Zimmerman, who has not slept properly in 8 days, who has watched his entire squad die in increments of buckshot, and realized his 3 years of training were preparation for the wrong war, answers with the honesty of complete exhaustion. We were trained for a different war. You weren't. The lieutenant doesn't understand. How could he? When American tactical flexibility and willingness to adopt whatever works regardless of tradition has given them victory after victory. He doesn't mention that the Ithaca 37 was developed for civilian hunting and cost less than a month's pay for a factory worker. He doesn't mention that Army brass initially rejected shotguns as uncivilized, more appropriate for police raids than military operations, until someone realized that urban warfare is exactly a series of police raids scaled up to division level. He doesn't explain that American doctrine is built not on tradition, but on the ruthlessly pragmatic question. What tool ends this fight fastest with minimum friendly casualties? Instead, he hands Zimmermann water and walks away, leaving the German to contemplate the lesson written in blood across Aachen's ruins. In modern warfare, doctrine becomes dogma, and dogma kills you when reality demands adaptation. The Americans adapted. They brought shotguns to a rifle fight and discovered that at the ranges where urban combat actually happens, the weapon optimized for that specific distance wins, regardless of military tradition or tactical elegance. And the Wehrmacht, so proud of its tactical sophistication and doctrinal purity, paid for that lesson with 5,000 casualties and the first German city to fall to Allied assault, not because German soldiers lacked courage, but because their doctrine lacked the imagination to conceive of warfare becoming this intimate, this savage, this fundamentally transformed by a $35 duck gun in determined hands. The silence after Aachen's surrender is more devastating than the artillery had been, because silence allows for accounting, for the careful tabulation of costs that combat's chaos mercifully obscures. The numbers arrive in after-action reports typed by clerks who never fired a shot. Statistical abstractions that represent actual human beings who bled out in medieval cellars or had their faces removed by buckshot in hallways, so narrow their bodies blocked passage. 5,000 German casualties across 19 days of combat. Over 2,000 American casualties, though the exchange ratio heavily favors the attackers in a way that inverts every assumption about urban defensive warfare. But these numbers, clinical and precise, cannot capture what actually died in Aachen beyond the men whose names fill casualty lists. What died was certainty itself, the bone-deep institutional confidence that tactical doctrine, refined through decades of military tradition, could predict and control the chaos of modern combat. The Battle of Aachen becomes a case study that will be dissected in military academies for generations, but the officers analyzing it from the safety of peacetime classrooms will miss the fundamental lesson unless they understand what it felt like to be Zimmermann on October 13th, watching his entire understanding of warfare disintegrate in 4 seconds of shotgun fire. American after-action reports document the effectiveness of 12-gauge shotguns with the cold precision that military bureaucracy demands. In room-clearing operations, the 12-gauge shotgun achieved first-shot incapacitation rates exceeding 95% at ranges under 15 feet, compared to 60 to 70% with standard rifles. Behind those percentages are specific human beings who died in specific ways. Corporal Dietrich, whose chest cavity simply ceased to exist. Private Schmidt, whose face became an anatomical impossibility. Dozens of others whose deaths were so efficient, so mechanically thorough, that they never had time to understand what weapon had killed them. The clinical language of military reporting cannot convey the psychological dimension of this effectiveness. The way the sound alone of pump-action shotguns in enclosed spaces created terror that transcended rational tactical calculation. German soldiers who'd survived the Eastern Front's apocalyptic slaughter broke at the sound of approaching Americans not from cowardice, but from the learned understanding that their training offered no defense, no counter-tactic, no doctrine for surviving an enemy who'd weaponized proximity itself. The transformation that Aachen forces on both armies reveals uncomfortable truths about the nature of modern warfare and humanity's infinite capacity for refining the mechanics of killing. For Germany, the lesson is existential and devastating. Defensive doctrine built on range, prepared positions, and superior tactical training cannot survive contact with enemies willing to close distance and optimize their weapons for the ranges where urban combat actually occurs. The Wehrmacht's entire military philosophy, inherited from Prussian tradition and validated across 5 years of continental warfare, assumed that technological sophistication and tactical discipline would triumph over brute force pragmatism. Aachen proves this assumption catastrophically wrong. The Americans didn't defeat German defenders through superior strategy or better training. They defeated them by recognizing that urban warfare creates its own physics, where traditional military thinking becomes actively harmful. When 90% of engagements happen at ranges under 20 feet, bringing rifles designed for 500-yard accuracy is bringing the wrong tool regardless of how beautifully engineered that tool might be. The shotgun, crude and uncivilized by Wehrmacht standards, proves optimal because it's designed for exactly the ranges where Aachen's combat occurs. This isn't just a tactical defeat. It's a philosophical one. The revelation that military tradition can become military suicide when conditions change faster than doctrine adapts. For the surviving German defenders, this lesson manifests as profound psychological trauma, distinct from conventional combat stress. Zimmermann and thousands like him don't suffer from the randomness of artillery or the distance of sniper fire. They suffer from the intimate horror of watching defensive positions they'd prepared, according to approved doctrine, become slaughterhouses the moment Americans brought weapons that doctrine had never conceived of facing. For America, Aachen forces an equally uncomfortable transformation, though one ultimately accepted with characteristic pragmatism. The U.S. Army had entered the war with conventional notions about civilized warfare and appropriate military weapons. Shotguns were police tools, hunting implements, weapons for criminals and game wardens, but not for professional soldiers engaged in honorable combat. Senior officers and tacticians initially resisted their widespread adoption precisely because they represented a regression from military sophistication to something more primitive and disturbing. But junior officers and sergeants who actually cleared rooms and fought in Aachen's corridors understood what headquarters did not. Survival doesn't care about civilization, and soldiers don't have the luxury of maintaining sporting concepts of appropriate warfare when the alternative is dying, according to approved doctrine. The transformation happens with brutal speed. Shotguns go from barely tolerated specialty weapons to standard issue for urban assault units within weeks of Aachen's lessons reaching tactical commands. After-action reports circulate through division and corps headquarters, documenting the simple mathematical reality that shotgun-equipped point men suffer 30 to 40% lower casualty rates than rifle-only squads in building-clearing operations. This data drives decisions with the cold logic of institutional survival. Whatever keeps American soldiers alive and kills the enemy faster becomes doctrine, regardless of how it makes senior officers uncomfortable about the intimacy of modern killing. The psychological cost of this pragmatism doesn't appear in official reports, but it haunts the men who carried those shotguns through Aachen's ruins. One sergeant writes in a letter home, later preserved in division archives, "At 500 yards you shoot a target. At 10 feet you execute a human being who's looking at you. The shotgun saved my life and cost me something I can't name." This unnamed cost, the psychological burden of making industrial warfare brutally personal, becomes the hidden price of tactical victory, proof that weapons optimized for efficiency create spiritual casualties, even among those who survive physically intact. The legacy that emerges from Aachen's blood-soaked cellars transforms military doctrine worldwide in ways that echo through decades of subsequent urban combat. Every modern army now trains for close-quarters battle with weapons designed specifically for intimate ranges, accepting as fundamental principle what Aachen proved in October 1944. Urban warfare creates its own tactical environment where traditional military thinking must be discarded or adapted beyond recognition. The shotgun becomes just the first example of this principle. Subsequent decades bring submachine guns, breaching charges, flashbang grenades, and, eventually, entire tactical philosophies built around the assumption that city fighting happens at ranges measured in meters, not hundreds of yards. What dies in Aachen isn't just 5,000 German soldiers and 2,000 Americans. It's the comfortable fiction that warfare can be kept at distance, that tactical doctrine can impose order on chaos, that military tradition matters more than practical effectiveness in saving soldiers' lives. Klaus Zimmermann survives the war and returns to Aachen in 1947 to help rebuild the city he once defended. He becomes a construction foreman, working on the very buildings where his squad died, where defensive doctrine met pragmatic American violence and shattered like glass. In a 1982 interview for a German military history journal, Zimmermann, now 59 years old and carrying the weight of decades spent processing October 1944, offers this assessment. We were taught that courage, training, and position were everything. Aachen taught us that in war, survival belongs to whoever adapts fastest. The Americans brought shotguns to a rifle fight and changed warfare forever. We paid for that lesson with blood, but the lesson was true. It's a remarkable statement of clarity from a man who earned the right to bitterness, but chose understanding instead. Recognition that the Americans who killed his friends weren't monsters, but soldiers who grasped a fundamental truth faster than Wehrmacht doctrine allowed. In the intimate hell of urban combat, the weapon that ends fights fastest at actual engagement ranges saves more lives than the weapon that performs beautifully at theoretical distances. This lesson, purchased with 7,000 casualties in 19 days of savage fighting, becomes the foundation of modern urban warfare doctrine, proof written in blood and buckshot that innovation doesn't care about tradition. Adaptation doesn't care about military elegance, and survival in war belongs to those willing to abandon comfortable doctrine when reality demands something more brutal and more effective.